Alright, so here's what I wanted to do for today. I wanted to go ahead and start teaching a bit about PHP classes, because PHP classes are one of the most powerful aspects of PHP, and they allow you to do all kinds of really nice things. So let's go ahead and begin here. I'm going to create a file here called classes.php, and I'll open it up with the way you normally open up a PHP file, by the angle bracket and question mark. Alright, so we create a class by first of all typing the keyword class, followed by what we want to call the class. And I'm going to call this class tExample. I then put a curly brace to open the class and a curly brace to end the class. Everything in here is the class. Okay, so the reason that I'm calling this tExample instead of just example is because the way that I'm using a class here is I am telling PHP what I want my class to be like, but I'm not actually creating it yet. I'll create it later, and so what I'm doing right now is I'm basically creating a template for a future class. Now, any class has basically two things. It has methods / functions, which are part of the class, and you can call these functions from outside of the class. I'll show you how to do that. And then also variables. Now, the cool thing about a class is that the variables in the class can be seen and used by all of the methods in the class if you set it up to work that way. Now, in some languages you refer to these as methods, in others you refer to them as functions. It's more, in my opinion, a matter of semantics. I'm sure that PHP has their own way of calling it, which is probably functions. But for the sake of this lesson, I'm just going to call it functions. Alright, so let's create a function. We're going to create a function called first function. And I'm just going to make this really simple. All it is going to do is echo hello. Now, if I try to run this program, I'll save it and I'll try to run it. Nothing will happen because I haven't actually told PHP that I actually want to use this class, and even more than that, I haven't actually called this function. So remember, right now it's just a template for a class that doesn't exist yet. So if I want to make this class become real, what I can do is I can create a variable here that I'll call $example, and I'll set it equal to new tExample. tExample is the template that I am using to create this class. Now, if I had a different class template here, let's call it tExample2, and here I have a different function. Let's call this second function for the fun of it, and I'll say world here. So by saying new tExample, I'm specifically saying that I intend to use this class template. And if I were to say new tExample2, then I would be specifically saying I want to use this class template. So any questions so far? Okay, so let's see this in action. Right now, I'm going to start by setting my new variable, $example, equal to new t_example, which means that what this does specifically is I am instantiating a class called $example, which is based on the template defined above as t_example. So you can think of the syntax here as class to instantiate equals new template. That's the general syntax. You can call the class whatever you want to call it. It doesn't have to be related to the name of the template. It can be whatever name you want. So now that I've done that, I can go ahead and start using the functions inside of the class $example. So if I call a function here, the syntax to call a function is an arrow, specifically a minus character and a greater than sign. And that is how you call a function inside of a class. So if I want to call the function called first function, I just do that. Notice that before I can call any functions, I must instantiate the class. Now that I've done that, though, I can go ahead and call the function. And you'll see that it says hello. Okay. Now, if I want to demonstrate the other class template, I can go ahead and instantiate t_example2, and I'll call second function. So notice what I'm doing here. $example is the name of my class. I'm instantiating it based on t_example2 now, which is this. And now notice that t_example2 has no such function called first function, because that's a function that I've created inside of t_example. But it does have a function called second function. And so now I can call that function like I've done here. And when I run this program, both of you tell me what the output will be. Exactly. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. Alright, so now what happens if you have the same function name inside of two classes? So I can do that here. I can create another function here. Let's do it down here. I'll create another function here called second function. And I'll create another function here called first function. Okay, so these are just words that I'm echoing just to kind of demonstrate the way that this works. So now notice that even though I've instantiated example2, example2 now has a function called first function, and if I call it, it will say else. Now, if I were to instantiate t_example again and call second function, it's going to say something, and so on. Now the other thing that you can do is you can instantiate more than one class at a time. So I can, for example, instantiate t_example with $example, and I can instantiate example2 as t_example2. And now I can go ahead and call all of the functions here like so. I can say, here, let me just scroll up here so that you can see it. So I've got t_example first function says hello. And example2 second function will say world. So if I run this program, let me just make one slight change here. I want to add spaces at the end of these words so that they don't run together too much. There we go. So now if I run this program, what will be the output? Right, exactly. So if I run it, okay, so if I run this program, it says hello world. Now, if I wanted this to instead say something else, both of you type out what I would need to do in order to make the output of this say something else. Specifically, how would I change these two lines? Yep, exactly. So let me go ahead and do that so that we can see that that works. And there we go, something else. Okay, so this is the first basic introduction to classes. Now, I have not yet explained what a class is. I'm hoping that that's going to become apparent through example. Right now, you can think of a class as a collection of related functions, and that's a start to a good understanding. So let's make this something a little bit more interesting here. Let's create a class here that I'm going to call, let's see, what would be a good example here? Let's create a class I'm going to call tString, which is going to be related to handling certain string functions. So right now, we're only thinking of a class as a collection of related functions. So I'm going to create a function here called, let's say, capitalize. And the way capitalize will work is this will capitalize the first letter of the string sent to it. So I'm also going to create a function here called make lowercase. This will cause the entire string to become lowercase. And maybe one called strip spaces. This will remove any spaces from the string. Okay, so these are just a few simple examples right off the top of my head of an example of some related functions in a class. So before I can use any of these functions, what do I have to do, both of you? Okay, right, I have to instantiate the class. So to do that, I am going to create a name of the variable that I want to call it. Now, I used the same as the name of the class in my previous example, and I like that. It's generally what I do. So I'm just going to call this $string is equal new tstring. Now I can start using these functions. I can say $string arrow capitalize. And how do I know for sure that this function actually gets called? Well, the easiest way to do that is I'll just add an echo statement here saying you are in capitalize. So if I run this program, we can see that this is working just fine. Okay. Now, how do I make it actually capitalize the first letter of the string? Well, there's a lot of ways that I can do that. And I want to be a little creative here. So first of all, before I can capitalize a string, it needs to see the string that can be capitalized. There's basically two ways we can do this. The first way is I can just go ahead and tell it that there's going to be a parameter here called string, which is going to be sent to the function. So here, for example, I can just give it the string here in quotes. All right. So I can test that it can see the string by just doing this. Notice the way I use the dot concatenation operator. And the way that works is whenever you have a string of text like this, for example, and you want it to become this, you simply put dots in between. You simply put dots in between each part of the string that you want to concatenate. And that's what does that. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking the string of text that says the string you've asked to capitalize is, and then I'm ending that and I'm putting a dot, and then the variable $string, which corresponds to the parameter received by the function, and that will allow me to see that in fact it's working properly. So, and there you go. The string you have asked to capitalize is Carl. So that's one way that I can send it to the function. But there's another way that I can do this also, which is when I instantiate the class, I can send data directly to the class that all the functions can use later. And the way I do that is right here where I have my new tstring. I can go ahead and send the string of text here. And now notice that there isn't a function that this would call. I have a function called capitalize, make lowercase, and strip spaces, but what function is going to be able to see this string of text Carl? The answer is I have to create one, and it's a special kind of function. It's called a constructor. There's two ways to write a constructor. You can either write it by using the exact name of the class, just like you have here. So I have tstring here, so I can create a function called tstring, and that becomes the constructor function. Like so. And now you'll see that when I run this program, it says when you instantiated this class, you sent the string of text Carl. The other way that I can write a constructor, which is more common, is with 2 underscores and the word construct. And it's the exact same thing. But the advantage to doing it this way is that if at some point in the future I decide to change my class name from tstring to something else, I don't have to change the name of the constructor. So to be clear, the constructor is called as soon as the class is instantiated. Anytime you have a constructor, that constructor will be called as soon as you instantiate the class, even if it doesn't receive any parameters. So for example here, if I change this so that I'm not sending anything to the class, and I run it, you'll see that the constructor is still called. It says the constructor was still called. Okay, so let's go back to where I am sending a string of text to the constructor. Okay, so the question now is, how can I make $string as it's been sent to the constructor visible to the other functions inside this class? And the answer is with a special kind of variable called $this. And whenever you begin a variable name with $this arrow, it will now be visible to every function in the class. So if I create a variable called $this arrow string, and I set it equal to $string, now any function in the class can use $this arrow string. So what I'm going to do here is, first I'm calling the constructor, I'm sending the constructor the variable $string, then I am setting $this arrow string is equal to $string, which allows every function in the class to see it. And now when I call the capitalized function here, you'll see that it will actually be able to see the string of text that I sent it earlier. And it says at the bottom, the string you have asked to capitalize is Carl. Okay, so that's one way that you can do things. Another thing that you can do is you can have other information sent to the constructor that is not sent to the functions, or vice versa. You can, for example, have a class where the constructor makes it so that the other functions are ready to do what they do. There's a lot of flexibility you have as a programmer as far as how you use this. There's not just one right way of using classes. And so now I want to take a break from this and start to explain the ideas behind classes in general. So I'm just going to create a example class here. So first of all, a class is a collection of functions and data. That's the most basic explanation here. Now, the functions should generally be related because they're going to be working on the same type of information. So let's do this. I might have, for example, a class called security. Let's suppose that this relates to things like logging in, validating if someone is logged in, things like that. So how would this work? I might have a function called isLoggedIn. And this function determine if the user is already logged in. And then I might have a function called login. This function will cause someone to log in. Then I might have a function called logout. Oops. this will log the person out, and so on. So you can see here that the idea of a class is to take related operations, related functions, and put them together into a single place, which serves a lot of purposes. One advantage to using classes is that the function names inside of a class only have to be unique to that class. And that's something I showed you earlier with my T example and T example 2, which both had functions called first function and second function. If you were not using classes, if we were just using functions, then every function name that we use must be unique. So if I create a function called begin, for example, and okay, I'll wait for the add. Okay, so what I was just saying is that in a class, the functions only have to be unique to the class. But if we weren't using a class, then every function must have a unique name. So for example, if I have a function called begin, and I can call that function perfectly fine. Notice I don't have to use classes. PHP is a programming language that gives us the option to use classes if we want, or functions if we want. So if I run this, you'll see that it says here is where we begin, because it runs that function. However, later on I can't use another function called begin. And obviously this is going to create a conflict. It's going to give me an error that says cannot redeclare begin, because I can only use begin once. Now that might not sound like a big problem, because you're thinking, well, if I'm writing the code, I'll just make sure that my functions all have unique names. But what happens if you're using someone else's code, or you're importing some file you downloaded on the internet that has functions in it? How can you be 100% sure that those functions will all have unique names? And you can see the potential for conflicts is large, especially because many functions have similar names, things like begin or start or things like that. So the nice thing about a class is that if I do this as a class, I can create a class called, let's just say T example, and I'll have my begin here, and then I can have another class, I'll call it a T example 2, and I can have that, and now I can go ahead and instantiate both classes. And now I can specify which function I want to call, even though they're both called begin. And this one will say here is where we begin. And here it'll say this is another begin function. Okay, so at this point, do either of you have any questions about PHP classes so far? Okay, so why don't we do that now? So I've explained the basics of classes. Let's go ahead and actually start talking about some real operations that we can do with classes. So what I'm going to do here is exit this program, and I'm going to make a directory here called examples. And inside of this directory, I'm going to create a file called, let's say, first of all, index.php. And this is going to be more like an HTML file, at least for right now. Okay. Okay. Now, if I load this page up here, let's see. Okay, whoops. Yeah, do wrong here. Okay, there we go. So it says hello, Carl. All right. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to replace Carl with a placeholder that I'm going to call just opening brace name, closing brace. And the idea here is I want to cause this to get filled in by the name, in this case Carl. So I'm going to make a slight change here. Okay. I'm going to create a subdirectory here called templates, and I'm going to move index.php into my templates directory. I'm going to call it index.html. Okay. And now I'm going to create a new index.php. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say that I want to read that file and then echo it. Okay. So it should still do exactly what I had before. So let's refresh it. Okay, good. So you see now that it says opening brace name, closing brace. Okay, so now let's create a class that can allow me to do this kind of replacing. So I'm going to create a class here called, let's say, I don't see Skype anywhere. Where did Skype go? There's Skype. Okay. Let's set this to always on top for right now. Alright, so here is our file. Alright, so yeah. Okay. I can see it's right there. Okay. So let's move this up so I can see everything. There we go. Okay, that works. All right. So now I'm going to create a class here called, let's just say, template. And inside of this class, I'm going to have a function called setPlaceholder. And the purpose of this function is that I'm going to replace name with Carl when I call this function. Okay, so first of all, I have the contents of the entire HTML file, which I'll open up here so you can see it. Right here, where I basically have this hello name. And now over here, I'm going to instantiate this class. And I'm going to send it $contents as the call it the $this variable that it's going to use. So I'm going to create a constructor here, and I'm going to say that $this contents equals contents. Okay. And now I don't need to have this echo contents anymore because I'm going to create a function for that. I'm going to create a function here called function show contents, which is simply going to echo $this contents. So already we're starting to see classes in a more, in a way more what you would see in a real development situation. So we have a function here called show contents. We have a constructor that loads the contents into the class. And if I just run that function and nothing else, we should see that it works just fine. Alright, so let's go ahead and, before we show the contents, let's go ahead and set placeholder name with Carl. Okay, so now I'm going to say that set placeholder obviously is receiving 2 strings as arguments, so I'm going to do that here. I'm going to call it placeholder and value. And the idea here is I simply want to say that $this contents is now equal to string replace of $placeholder with $value of $this contents. So if I do that and I run this, it now says hello Carl. So the nice thing too about working with classes is you can start to build on the complexity of a class, and everything is all kind of contained. So you don't have, so you're much more free to build on a class without worrying that you're stepping on the toes of anything else that you're doing. I can build out as many functions here as I want, and it'll be just fine. So I can save a step here because I'm defining $contents as file get contents based on the name of this templates directory. So if I really want to here, I can just go ahead and save a step by just saying file get contents template index.html here, and I can get rid of $contents altogether because the class takes care of that. I'm just sending the contents of that file to the class. And another thing that I could do if I wanted to is I could let the constructor handle that and just give it the name of the template file that I'm working with, which could be, for example, index. So if I wanted to do that, something like this, for example, and then I can go ahead and cause the constructor to do this. And this will correspond to, for example, templates/index.html, and it'll still work perfectly fine. So now if I save this and I run it, it still works perfectly fine. Okay. Now another thing that I could do is I could create a new function here called set template file, and I could go ahead and have that create $this contents rather than the constructor. And then instead of the way I have it here, what I could do is I could call that function, I could just simply call $this set template file $name. Notice that when you call one function from within another, you use $this arrow, the same as you specify variables. So now what I'm doing is when the constructor gets called, it is going to call the function called setTemplateFile, and it will pass to that function, in our example, index, and then that will set $contents, and then we'll be able to still get the exact same result. The advantage now, though, is that I don't need to send that to the constructor anymore. I can just call the setTemplateFile from right here when I create this, something like this. I can say setTemplateFile index. And now it will call setTemplateFile, which is right here. It will set $this contents. So I should really put that as a comment. And then lastly, and the other thing that I could do here is just to cause this to be more, to make a little bit more sense, I'll take out the braces from here and I'll put them inside of the function instead of setPlaceholder. So I'll just put them right here using concatenation. And that just allows me to write a little bit cleaner code when I'm doing these assign operations, because when I set the placeholder name to Carl, it just makes a little bit more sense. Now notice that I am able to do as many placeholders as I want. So for example, I can say hello name, and then under here I'm going to put H3. Today is day. And now I'll just go ahead and do another template, set placeholder, day, Saturday. And you'll see how that works. Okay. So let's stop here for right now and take a break for questions. Here, I'll do one better. I'll go ahead and put both of these on CodePad real quick. That way you can see it on CodePad. There you go. Okay, here, let me just take a quick aside and show you some about the str underscore replace function. And yes, it does. Okay, so let's talk about string replace. Okay, so I have my main string of text, and I want to see how string replace works. So first of all, string replace accepts 3 parameters. The first one being the first one being what you want to replace. The second being what you want to replace it with, and the third being where these 2 things are located. In other words, the string as a whole. So here, if I run this, you'll see that my example of this with a capital T has been changed to this with all capital letters. But notice that this has not changed $string. So if I echo $string here, let's see. Notice that where it says $string is still set to this is a test. So the str underscore replace function returns the result of the string replace operation, but it doesn't change the original string. If I want it to change the original string, I have to do this. And now if I echo $string, you'll see that it's been changed. So in our example of the placeholder, when I'm basically saying this, so the reason it's like that is, first of all, the fact that I'm beginning by saying $this arrow contents equals means that the result of the string replace will change $this arrow contents to be the result of the string replace. In other words, the new $this underscore or $this arrow contents will have replaced placeholder with name. And then here, in this case, placeholder is just simply name, for example, and value can be, for example, Carl. And so it should be pretty simple here as to what's going on. Let me just create a really simple class to demonstrate this. Okay, so this calls the constructor, and by calling the constructor, I'm going to be setting $this contents, and I'm going to be doing this string replace on it. And now, you'll see how it says my name is Carl. And if I want to go ahead and just take this to the next step, or like this, and now I can just go ahead and do the two replace operations before I show the contents. And now if I run this, you'll see my name is Carl and today is Saturday. And I'll go ahead and put this on CodePad too. There we go. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and call it a day now, assuming there's no more questions. Okay, good deal. So yeah, if either of you have questions, just message me on Skype, and I'll go ahead and call it a day now. So I hope you both enjoyed the lesson, and I guess we'll schedule our next lesson on Skype. Okay, bye.